Oliver Macdonagh, responding to a festschrift a few years ago, disclaimed his right to any such thing. If I can quote him, he said, "I had no teachers. I have no disciples. I founded no school. I possess no theory of history. I am master of no field. From time to time, I catch a horrid vision of myself as a sort of pinchbeck ultimus Romanorum, a last general practitioner among consultants, a chance survivor from a vanquished world." I think one should notice in that the ironic tone amid the genuinely modest disclaimers, because every single one of those statements is highly questionable and many of them completely wrong. Macdonagh's work has started hairs in all sorts of directions, from the debate on early Victorian government to the morass of Anglo-Irish relations in the present as well as in the past. The point being, I think, that his genius is uniquely and urbanely to provoke an impassioned discussion, often in a very laconic way, and then to move on to another part of the field altogether. The historian as icebreaker, as he has described it on one occasion, rather than ring-fencing and defending one patch of territory all one's life. And he's left his mark with, I think, a brio and a very notable style, which is hardly equalled in his generation. So, Oliver Macdonagh, can I ask you, as a historian to whom places mean a lot, as appears in your work, something about your own origins and influences? You were born in, and I think brought up in, Carlow.
I was born in Carlow, not brought up there. I was brought up effectively as a boy in the west of Ireland, in Roscommon, which is a tiny town. Had, I think, 1,990 inhabitants, 1,983 of whom were Roman Catholics. I can remember a great deal about its landscape, which was of a gentle kind, but the things I think that affected me most looking back on it were the intensity that one learned from living in the immediate aftermath of a civil war, that the politics was a really serious and divisive business.
You moved on to another intense location, which was Clongowes, the great
That's
Jesuit
right.
school before UCD. Did Clongowes and a Jesuit training leave a mark on you?
I think so, yes. A literary mark, anyhow. The teachers I had for English were two Jesuits who were remarkably good. All my life I'd had remarkably bad history teachers. And one of them, he was a very bad novelist himself, but he was a great patron of his charges. And he got me to encourage the little flame of talent I had, essay writing. Got my poems published in the Irish Monthly, which I believe, if I may say so modestly, was where Yeats's first poems were published.
Indeed it was, yes.
But there the resemblance ends.
Then UCD and the L&H Debating Society and King's Inns and the Bar. Was that because a legal career commended itself to you, or because it was an intellectual training that you thought would help your historical bent?
Well, these were in the desperate 1940s, and the idea was that one got a profession or an occupation. I intended to be a barrister if I could survive the 3 or 4 years of starvation without any legal connections. I did actually learn, I think, at least there were lessons there which were very useful to me as a historian. I've remembering the emphasis in law on stating things precisely and getting the exact meaning, and nothing else would do, and working and worrying for the exact meaning. And the other thing I got was from it, I think, which is useful for historians, was an emphasis on decisions. Ideally, at least in law, you always end up one way or other in the end. And I think an occupational danger for historians is to fudge when things become difficult, and that law at least taught me to try to focus on making up one's own mind. And in the end, if the evidence was there, of course, I'm taking that for granted.
I've always thought of you as rather an Occam's razor kind of man, and I'd assumed that came from a good and strict training in the great Catholic theologians as much as in the law, but you would put your decision to strip away the inessential and to arrive at a decision to a legal approach or legalistic approach rather than a Newmanesque approach.
Well, I suppose I had my share of hand-me-down apologetics, and I'm sure that I learnt something from that, but as far as I can recall, it was the legal training which impressed me most on that particular point.
Yes, that's interesting. To continue with your odyssey, from UCD you went, as many others have done, or as a few distinguished others have done, on to Cambridge.
Yes.
In the late 1940s. A time when there were a number of very distinguished historians operating there. Could you say something about the historians there in your time who affected the way that you began to write history?
Well, the historians there were Galaxy, there were Butterfield, Knowles, Poston, Brogan, who was my supervisor, Graham Clark and Brian Wormald and Dennis Mac Smith among the Dons. This was all out of a fellowship of about 15, I think. It was very exciting. The people who influenced me most, I think, were the person who influenced me most in a very indirect way was David Knowles, simply because I found him so admirable a historian, so humane and correct and exact and just and so on. Brogan he was my supervisor. We rarely met, but he was a delightful supervisor because he always arranged supervisions for the Reform Club. And though we lived on the same staircase for a time, he was away so much. And he was a wonderful friend to have, but he was utterly uncritical where it came to research students. He would simply say, put a little tick like a primary school. Very good. After a whole chapter, just correct your spellings and give you a torrent of other reading to do, and that was all.
But this gave you a free rein, presumably.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes.
I
have had a charmed life, and I'm not being relatively uninfluenced by other historians.
This is what you mean about having bad teachers.
Well, I was thinking of school in that case, but I don't, one way or another, I seem to have escaped much teaching.
Yes. Was Kitson Clark influential in your decision to approach the early Victorian period the way you did?
No, he wasn't. I was hoped to have him as supervisor when I went to Cambridge, but at that time I think he had a thing about Irish subjects, anyhow he sheared off, and Brogan, who was a sort of Statue of Liberty person, he took in everybody. So the curious result was that I didn't meet Kitson Clark until I'd finished my PhD, and I was 5 years in Cambridge before I met him. But then, of course, he'd read something I'd written, and I was the pioneer speaker at his famous seminar.
And he encouraged you to write your, in a sense, well, the book you say is for the plain reader on early Victorian government.
Yes, he kept saying, Macdonagh, you must write this. Macdonagh, you must write this.
The idea being there that what you had done in your Pattern of Government Growth book about the Passenger Acts, and also in your famous article on the 19th century revolution in government, the idea being that this should be delivered to a general audience.
That's right, and put in a broader perspective.
Yeah.
Well, he though indeed he didn't mean the book to be, I'm sure, nor did I mean it to be simply an elaboration of the pattern of government growth. It was it dealt with various aspects of.
Indeed, it does. It casts a wide net. It also rather eschews discussion of the controversies which emerged from your really quite subversive work on early Victorian government. Was this a deliberate decision on your part?
Well, I'm not a very good deliberate decider. I'm sort of drift into things, but I suppose it was a and it was more or less a decision. I've always disliked controversy in history. Sometimes it's unavoidable and necessary, but I've a feeling that it rapidly becomes very wasteful, that people build themselves into positions and cease to hear, and that it's taking the economy of history writing as a whole. It tends to waste time and to stunt creativity. I know it's necessary that people should be put through the examination process and their work criticized. Nonetheless, the idea of spending your time writing counters and becoming narrower and narrower and blinder to any view except your own, which is probably would have happened to me, didn't appeal to me. It seemed to be a waste of time.
Could it be said that you cultivate a rather urbane and lapidary style in order to avoid that kind of engagement?
It could be said. You've said it. I hope it isn't true.
Well, it certainly, yes. I think it's a very good way of provoking discussion and then moving gracefully on.
Well, I mean, as a fellow Irishman, you'd know how this weakness we have for epigrammaticism and paradox, and a lot of what you say may be a reflection of that epigrammaticism.
One of the things that I think annoyed people in that government work was your dismissal is too strong a word, but your skepticism about the notion of a zeitgeist, specifically a Benthamite zeitgeist, which flowed into the mind of the governing classes. Does this reflect, in your approach, a general distrust of that kind of model for the way things happen?
Yes, I think it does. I think it was what annoyed people was the fact that I chose it as an example, if my memory is right, rather than as anything more than that. Benthamism itself, I mean, it's one of these concepts or bodies of ideas that people are very defensive about.
Yes.
Perhaps offensive about as well. And I think that got under some skins. And it was that rather than zeitgeist as such. But I did, from quite an early stage, have an uneasiness about this attribution of trains of historical decisions, and major trains, being attributed in a simple way to a body of ideas from which they seem to flow a doctrine. And that was, and all my life, I suppose, I've had that.
Yes, I think
skepticism.
That's quite true. If I could approach your earlier work from another angle, you use, I think in States of Mind, with great pleasure, a quotation from Buckle, who boasts, "I write the history of England because it is normal." I laughed out loud when I read that. And would it be true to say that you approached the history of England through an Irish interest, in that what you tend to do in your early work is to show that administrative history, if that's what we call it, can throw a different light on Irish history, especially if you approach it from as wide a knowledge as you do of the English world, especially of the 1830s and 40s. Did Ireland bring you to writing English administrative history, is what I'm asking?
I don't think so, no. I think that except in one special sense, in that I was always struck by what W.L. Byrne called the use of Ireland as a social laboratory, where experiments would take place that English would never dream of at the time. But the same is true of, as Eric Stokes pointed out, about India, and for something of the same reasons. So in that special sense, certainly I had that I had that at the back of my mind. But my interest in English social policy and the development of welfare institutions in the 19th century was I think, an intrinsic interest, not really coming from Ireland.
Didn't it begin with an interest in Irish emigration, though?
That's what set me off from the emigration officers.
Yes.
That they were round from the colonial office. They were all British half-pay naval officers. They're mostly stationed in British ports.
Yes.
So of course their father was mostly Irish immigrants. that's how I got led into it. But,
Yeah.
but it took me over.
The social laboratory idea, which, as you rightly say, was Burns', I think, formulation, but which you, I think, added enormously to, can be approached in two ways, can't it? On the one hand, it can be seen as a sort of argument that British government in Ireland wasn't the neglectful and deliberately oppressive machine which nationalist historiography made it out to be. On the other hand, it can be approached, to quote yourself, as showing that, or as simply indicating that it was thought Ireland needed a more rational, elaborate and autocratic system of repression than happier lands. Do you see your work as taking part of both those angles of interpretation, or as coming down more towards the repressive than the benevolent angle?
Oh, that's certainly that calls for Occam's razor. I suppose if I had to choose, I'd come down for the more repressive version. But what I had in mind well, I quoted Byrne, but I think it's a little misleading if it suggests, the element of deliberateness in planning. I think I went on to say that expedience be rather a better word than the experiments from the social laboratory. I mean, it was the logic of the situations, which arose from the position of political control and responsibility.
This is your coral reef idea.
Yeah.
Yes, which is an image you used, I think, very powerfully for the way that administrative structures develop. Well, as a very crude transposition, let's move from coral reefs to Australia, because pursuing this rather Jeju notion of influence, which I still think is very important, you began in 1963 what was to be a long association, and a very fruitful one, with Australian academe. I think you went temporarily first to, was it ANU and then Flinders?
Yes, I went to a research fellowship with the ANU, not in the Department of History, they wouldn't have me, the Department of Demography. At that stage I was flying under the colours temporarily of an emigrationist, and I did work, and I published something on the Irish in Australia, on the demographic essays, because partly because of there were so many Irish immigrants there. It's much the largest area per head of population of Irish settlement in the world. And secondly, Australian demographic and population records of all kinds are superb, perhaps the best in the 19th century. So it was this twin, it drew me there. And then I was asked, there was a new university being set up in Adelaide, and I was asked if I'd be one of the founding fathers. And it all seemed such a wonderful change from Cambridge, especially. This came in February after a very bad winter.
And a wonderful change from Ireland as well.
Well, I sort of had made that change, not deliberately, but that's the way things had fallen out. I didn't feel any more separate. Well, I didn't feel very much more separate.
But it was also in your Australian years that you produced at least two books, the two I'm thinking of certainly, which looked at Ireland through the other end of the telescope. Instead of the highly specific administrative and governmental history, you produced two extremely wide-ranging books, one Ireland, the Union and its Aftermath, as it was eventually called, and the other States of Mind, a survey really of Anglo-Irish misunderstandings over 200 years. Do you think you needed the distance in Australia to do that?
Yes, I think, well, I don't know if I needed it, but it certainly was very useful. The other thing was that in Cambridge I was getting more and more involved, happily involved, in British history. And I think I was, for example, lecturing on labour politics and socialism and so on, as well as the ordinary British constitution of the 19th century. And I think that this was a break and a wrench, and it suddenly my Irish interest reawoke very fully there, and that explains it. I think they probably dominated my time in Australia.
Looking at the Irv, that's what it certainly seems. Is there also something, do you think, in being in an environment where Ireland is not seen as in opposition to Britain, as it may have been from the Cambridge angle, but as a, well, the Irish experience in Australia is a very enabling experience, isn't it? I mean,
it's right. I think one thing that struck me early on was that it was the Australian, throughout the 19th century up to 1914, perhaps even up to 1939, the Australian population proportion was almost a mirror of that of the United Kingdom after 1801. And the Irish were in a very muted and pale form, in varying from colony to colony, in something of the same state of exclusion and from, to a degree, and of competitiveness,
yes,
and of a group identity, not completely. All this was in a very pale and minor form, and a gross oversimplification to say it was Ireland in 1801 writ small. But nonetheless, there was that element which intrigued me.
yes.
And the whole course of Australian development in the 19th century seemed to me to throw interesting light on at least the Home Rule movement, perhaps the repeal movement as well. But in the 1880s and 1890s, I believe that Australia contributed as much to the Irish National Party, the Land Leagues, and all the other organizations as came from the United States. That's in gross figures. Considering the difference of population was about 17 to 1 in terms of Irish derivation, that shows how of relative significance of Irish Australia.
Yes.
And what Irish Australia was saying, and what it built up contacts with the nonconformist liberals, was that what Ireland should have is what we already have here in New South Wales or in Victoria, responsible self-government. And Parnell's appeal, and especially after 1886, made a tremendous impact there. And it seemed to me that this was regarded as the apotheosis, or for the time being, the apotheosis of Australian development. And it threw a very interesting light for me on Ireland.
It's still a dimension, I think, which is under-researched and under-recognised, that imperial notion. Pressing this idea of how your work on Ireland developed in Australia, now you may well contradict me on this, but my impression from Ireland, the Union, and more especially States of Mind, is that in these books the gloves are coming off, in a sense. The language is more passionate, the style more audacious. If I could just give a quotation to give a flavour, when you write about late 19th century land legislation in the Union, you write, "Most important of all, the conception of society as operating on an essentially individualist and contractual basis in which market forces were the proper determinant of social and economic good had been irremediably breached. The great example of Ireland passive under British rule became in the end a paradigm of Ireland drastic. The man that once did sell the lion's skin while the beast lived was killed with hunting him." It's different from the urbanity, or the surface urbanity of your earlier work. These are very passionate books, especially, I think, States of Mind. Would you accept that, or do you think I'm reading something into them that isn't there?
Well, you're an excellent judge. If you say it, I accept it. but on that particular issue, as far as I recall, what I was suggesting was that I've forgotten the context, but probably was something to do with land legislation, something of that kind. Was that right? What I meant was that by the irony whereby the pursuit for reasons of control, of forced pursuit of certain policies, in the long run ended up with Britain
Yes.
blind and or suffering from, if one saw it like that. herself.
Yes, the message,
I don't know if that came across clearly.
the message that I was reading is that in the end, exploitation and, if you like, oppression received its own reward by a number of stunning historical ironies, with the buying out of the landlords being one of them.
Alas, I'm afraid that's all too generally true.
Yes, I think it probably is. But it's a tone that emerges in these later works more strongly, I think, than in the earlier ones. The other thing I'd like to put to you about states of mind, particularly, is that there's a chapter in it called Politics Bellicose, which I think is one of the most astringent reviews ever written of the tradition of violent rhetoric and violent deeds in Irish history. But that chapter ends by allowing what you call the emotional pull of violence for Irish people. I think Occam's razor and coming down to a decision isn't happening there. There's a deliberate ambiguity.
Well, I was trying to give to round out the picture by pointing to the ambiguity, the dualism there is in most Irish nationalist breasts, or was at the time I was writing, which is a long time ago. And I think it's a commonplace that people have these ambiguities, these elemental tribal feelings. It depends on the amount of pressure and circumstances, the degree to which they expose them. I thought a chapter on violence, without making this clear, would be just needed. I think I end with the Boswell quotation about the 45 and that about those who look at these things or expect sober rationality and calculation to last all the time, know very little about human nature. I meant it as I suppose, maybe I hope it wasn't too pompous a reflection of human nature in this situation of violence. But that's why I put it in. What I believe it wasn't to make a decision myself on violence. I was trying to describe the Irish nationalist reaction as I saw it.
No, pompous is the last thing it is. It's pessimistic.
Well,
and you move from that chapter, a bellicose, straight into a chapter called Politics Clerical. And I wondered if you saw that particular theme in Irish politics as being, the clerical theme, as being one way to rationalize and control these dangerous urges, which you'd written about in the previous chapter.
Well, perhaps yes, but I think you never really know what motives you have, I suppose, at the bottom. But I'm sure one of them was to have an ironic commentary on the preceding chapter, because one of the points I'm making in Politics Clerical is that the Catholic clergy en masse, especially the below episcopal ranks, but not excluding episcopal ranks by any means, were subject to the same pressures and feelings and pulls as the mass, or perhaps more so in their being articulate and educated, relatively speaking, more articulate. And yet there were their tight ecclesiastical discipline, the Roman influence, which was pretty consistently pro-British, the canon law on conspiracy and on use of arms, all these pulling. And I thought it a very sad, ironic situation, but that's what I went on to say that there are similar ironies if I had the knowledge and the time to do Ulster Unionists or British nationalists. I think in that chapter I mentioned that, but the one that I'm picking because it's relevant to my theme are Politics Clerical. And Politics Clerical seems to me to be a tremendous, I don't mean this tremendous in its own quality, but in intention, commentary on violence, because the clergy seem to me to express in a much more acute form and to be subject to these dilemmas and problems.
Yes, the relationship between those two themes is to me the core of that book, which is a book I've read and reread many times. It's also at the core of Daniel O'Connell's career, this tension between the use of an impulse that often declares itself in violent or confrontational acts, and the firm commitment to clerical politics, and working within the system by reining in these tensions. Were you working on O'Connell when you wrote States of Mind?
No, I've been thinking about O'Connell well, not directly for a long time, but I was afraid to like starting to put your foot at the bottom of Everest. Just seems so huge, so big. I've been collecting material for a long time, but no, I hadn't begun. But what I wanted to write, what I set out to do was I suppose, a grandiose idea. It seemed to be that there was no proper study of how a modern Irish Catholic nationalism had developed. And I of course, it's very difficult to sort of think of how you get a popular cast of mind or whatever. But I thought the way to do it was to study O'Connell, both because he was a key figure in shaping it and expressing it, and because he seemed to be a fine exemplar of its progress in the first half of the 19th century. But I began with this in mind, and I began with the sort of, as I always do, with the easy parts first. The easiest part was one about his secret marriage and his hiding the marriage from the curmudgeonly uncle from whom we great expectations. And this sort of human development just caught me, and I it became a biography. I just couldn't help it. But I hope the underlying beat is there of these large cultural things. I didn't specify them, but I hope that it came through, because that's really what I meant to write about.
The theme which you mentioned, the marriage, the uncle, the money, could come straight out of a Trollope novel.
Oh, yes.
And creative literature, especially of the 19th century, preoccupies you, I think, and we'll go back to that. But in a sense, when I look at your writing and at O'Connell, it is in some ways the inevitable subject for you. It's like a great 19th century novel, even in its scale. It has the themes of love and money and politics. And would it be true to say that there's an appeal there for you too, because the period which you've chosen to locate a lot of your work in is the period when romantic and utilitarian themes are, in a sense, in a creative tension with each other, and that this is true of O'Connell himself.
Very true of him, yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I agree with you completely. I think that's... I find, as I went to my predecessor in the research school in the Australian National University, John Lenose, he used to say, nobody should write biography until they're over 50, because they haven't lived enough. And I laughed very secretly at this when I heard it in the 30s. But when I came to write O'Connell in my 50s, I could see the point, because the structure of my life, the mechanics of my life, even to having 7 children and all the business of which running this complex enterprise involves, and of course, I saw O'Connell as at the start of in Catholic terms, the second Counter-Reformation, the earliest in the English-speaking world. And I saw myself as a youth in the final stage of the same historical phenomena. And I saw the Ireland in which I grew up as the epitome, apart from the violence which produced it, exactly what O'Connell would have dreamt of, with Westminster and the law courts and Whitehall and everything transposed, but power transferred.
Yes.
It seemed to me that I got all sorts of little things because I'd been through the same range of experience. So there became, I didn't intend it like that, there became that very personal sort of...
Yes.
You have a sort of... It's just you have the secret codes, the little information that alerts you to certain things.
That leads me to think of the kind of writers who attract you, creative writers, because you use creative literature not just as a jejune illustration of what's going on, but as a way into mentality. You've done this, I think you were doing this very early. I come across references throughout your work. You may completely contradict me on this, but it seems to me that the novelists you're drawn to, I think of Somerville and Ross, you've written about the real Charlotte, Peacock, most of all Jane Austen are writers who notoriously dismiss what I think you've called in your essay on Sanditon the claptrap of modernity. They're merciless parodists of fashion. Again, your work on Sanditon, I think, shows that very clearly. Is this kind of rather astringent approach particularly sympathetic to you among novelists?
It is sympathetic to me, but I think my tastes are more Catholic. The novelists I read most is Trollope, whom one could hardly categorize with the others in that regard.
No.
And George Eliot, Mrs. Gaskell, Charlotte Bronte. These are the ones that I. Charlotte Bronte, particularly. Well, she's one, especially, except for Jane Eyre.
They're
Anyhow, you mustn't lead me into talking about novels.
I won't. But I wondered how this related to your early work, which is more politely skeptical about the notions of a Benthamite zeitgeist, as I've said earlier. You seem to like a way into the 19th century mentality that discounts such easy assumptions. There is another tension. I seem to keep coming back to tensions in your work, which is one of the reasons I think why people read it with such profit. But there is a tension in your work from the historian's point of view between the acceptability of large patterns or not. In the Austen book, you very tersely remark that historians must periodize or perish. This is, I think, claiming that the Regency must be seen as something entier of itself. Yet in States of Mind, you almost flamboyantly don't periodize. These are very thematic essays, taking almost an analyst approach towards abstract issues like time, place, and so forth, and swerving through 200 years on those themes. Do you think that is an implicit contradiction or not?
I think that's a fair cop. It is a contradiction, I think. I suppose it is. It's absolutely right. Like I can only plead Walt Whitman or something. But I suppose that if I had to say something in defence of this argument against States of Mind, is that I was using the whole 200 years as a period, roaming up and down. I've never thought about it before, but if I had to mount a defence, I would think you could periodize variously. You can speak of small epochs within larger ones, but this doesn't affect the generalization periodize or perish. What I meant was that if you didn't, you couldn't envisage history writing without periodization.
No.
That's what I meant.
No. We've talked about patterns in history and the way you conceive of it, and the reconciliation of different tensions. Reading the few aperçus of intellectual autobiography, which you've let us have, and I think reading between the lines of, for instance, the conclusion to your Fitzpatrick book, I'd infer that a very strong, though subtle, conditioning influence on you is Catholic philosophy of a traditional and rather stringent kind. You mentioned Duns Scotus from time to time, as well as, of course, Newman. Do you think that's accurate or not?
Oh, I think that's accurate. I don't know if the stringency suggests a greater degree of scholarship than I have in it, but it is absolutely true. Yes, I have been coloured by it, and I suppose always will be. And yes, undoubtedly.
But I wonder, in conclusion, really, if this predisposition of yours, this intellectual training or conditioning, or whatever we're going to call it, goes with a certain pessimism about human ambitions, whether Benthamite or other, as well as human frailty. Do you think you cast a rather cold eye on attempts at betterment, whether in patterns of government growth or political utopianism?
Oh, I'm afraid I must plead guilty to the charge. I suppose I come down on that side. Not by choice, but it's just my nature and reading.
It seems to me something that comes through your work strongly and more strongly as the work progresses, though it's tempered with your belief in what you've called humaneness and with a very strong, as I say, conditioning in Catholic and specifically Catholic philosophy. But you've described, just to go back completely full circle, I began this interview by saying you described the historian's function as an icebreaker, to plough up the surface and leave things churning around and then move on to a different part of the terrain. What waters would you most like to have left disturbed in your wake of the various areas that you've explored?
I think I'd like to have 18th century social reform, the sort of Fitzpatrick work. I'd like a great deal of effort in that field. I'm sure it's rewarding, and I think it's largely hidden. I think, as far as I know, there's been very little work in this field, and I'm sure this is something where new ploughing would yield a harvest. Fascinating one, because of the one has there not only pre-Benthamism, if you like, but one has the evangelical movement, the 18th century Enlightenment rationalist, if you want to put it in intellectual influences. But the tension, to use the word that you keep using, between the 18th century political structures as they were evolving and the pressures to humane pressures or other pressures, statistical pressures, to produce social change is fascinating. 1780s, 1770s, 1790s.
And this is the area you'd like most to leave, as I say, churned up, rather than the rethinking of Anglo-Irish relations or the notably perceptive new angle, I think, on the relations between creative literature and 19th century life and politics.
Well, I thought you meant which area that I think would yield most fruit by being, which area was that I touched on was most.
No, I was vainly, I suppose, I was looking for a more self-regarding response from you, which is, which area do you think you've done most to engage with that sort of, or to leave behind that sort of churning up?
I would like to think it would be Anglo-Irish relations. I don't know whether it is. I would like that, but that's well, it's very natural. It's something that touches you personally much more deeply and acutely than the other areas.
Well, I think you would be right. Thank you very much, Oliver Macdonagh.